The sun had just begun to rise over the rugged peaks of the Grand Tetons, stretching long shadows across the valleys below. It was the kind of morning that promised a perfect hike. But for Amelia Turner, this summer day would mark the beginning of a mystery, one that would leave loved ones searching for answers. At 24, Amy had always felt a deep connection to the mountains. She was drawn to their vastness, their untamed beauty, and the quiet challenge they presented. A seasoned solo hiker, she wasn't careless. Instead, she thrived in the steady, peaceful rhythm of the wilderness. Amy had recently left behind the hectic pace of city life for the solitude of Jackson Hole. Here, the only things that seemed to matter were the rustle of the wind through the trees and the crunch of her boots on the trail. This was the life she had always dreamed of. On Friday, August 12, 2023, she embarked on what would be her most challenging adventure yet, a 4-day hike along the Paintbrush Canyon Cascade Loop. Every aspect of the trip had been thoughtfully organized. She'd planned her meals, chosen her route carefully, and selected Holly Lake as her first campsite. Her mother, Sarah, had watched her prepare, sensing Amy's excitement as she double-checked her gear. Amy had reassured her with a smile, showing the satellite phone she intended to use for nightly check-ins. "Don't worry," she said. "I've got this." It was meant to be the perfect journey, an opportunity to test her limits and capture the Tetons' breathtaking beauty with her Nikon D750, which hung from her neck, ready to document each step. Just before she set off, she texted her mum a photo from String Lake. She was grinning. With the towering mountains behind her, the message read, "Off I go. The mountains are calling. Weather's perfect. Talk to you Sunday night." But Sunday came and went, and there was no message, no calls, nothing. At first, Sarah told herself not to panic. Maybe Amy had just gotten caught up in the scenery. But by Monday, her unease grew. The silence didn't feel like an oversight, it felt like something was wrong. At 7:15 p.m. on Monday, Sarah called the Teton County Sheriff's Office. Within an hour, Park Ranger Tom Albright was at the String Lake trailhead. Amy's silver Subaru was still there, parked exactly as she'd left it. Nothing looked out of place. The car was clean, orderly, with a thin layer of pollen coating the windshield. But that normalcy was unsettling. Something didn't add up. This didn't resemble the typical missing hiker scenario. Amy hadn't signed in on the trail register. A search began immediately. Crews swept through the dense forests and over the rugged ridges, hoping to find any sign of her. But every new step only deepened the mystery. Her gear wasn't at Holly Lake, where she'd intended to set up camp. There were no visible tracks, no direction to follow. It was as if she had simply vanished. A trained canine named Zeus was brought in to help. His powerful sense of smell made him an invaluable part of the search. He caught Amy's scent near the trailhead, but couldn't track it far. The trail seemed to fade into nothing, swallowed by the vast wilderness. Missing person cases usually leave some trace behind, a footprint, a broken branch, a lost item. But this time, there was nothing. This case didn't follow any of the usual patterns, and that made it all the more haunting. The wilderness kept its silence, unwilling to give up its secrets, and Amy Turner was still missing. But the search was far from over. What began as a rescue effort was slowly becoming something much more complex. As the days passed, the hope that Amy had simply lost her way began to fade. The peaceful air in Jackson grew heavier, tension mounting. With each passing hour, by the third day, it was clear this wasn't just a matter of someone wandering off the trail. Search teams had expanded. Rangers, volunteers, and even members of the National Guard had joined the effort. Yet the forest remained quiet. It was as if the land itself had swallowed her whole. Officer Sarah Jenkins, alongside her canine partner Zeus, was among those leading the search. Trained to track scent where humans could not, Zeus had proven invaluable in countless operations. But this time, something was different. He was restless, uneasy, as if he sensed something beyond human understanding. 1 week into the search, Sarah felt the weight of each unanswered question bearing down on her. It was as if time was stretching, making each day feel longer than the last. Amy's name was slowly fading into the ever-growing list of those lost to the wild. But Sarah wasn't ready to let her become just another statistic. She knew that the truth was out there, hidden somewhere among the jagged peaks and dense forests of the Tetons, and she was determined to find it. Zeus, loyal and focused, was her greatest ally in that pursuit. His instincts were sharp, but even he had begun to falter. Time and again, he would catch a scent only for it to vanish into thin air. No clear direction, no trail to follow. Each lead ended the same way, in silence. And with each fruitless attempt, Sarah's certainty wavered. The more they searched, the more she began to wonder. What if the truth they were chasing wasn't what they wanted to find? Each day following Amy's disappearance felt like a lifetime. The pressure grew with every failed lead. Whenever Sarah and Zeus ventured into the wilderness, the quiet around them was almost overwhelming, an eerie stillness that made even the rustle of branches feel significant. By the end of that first week, even the most optimistic members of the team were struggling to maintain hope, despite helicopters, ground teams, and countless hours combing through the terrain. They had found almost nothing. Amy's campsite had been discovered. Her tent perfectly set up, exactly where she had planned to spend the night. Everything was in place as if she had just stepped away, yet she was nowhere to be found. No tracks, no items left behind, no struggle. Just an empty tent surrounded by endless wilderness. For a dog as skilled as Zeus to hit a wall was unusual and troubling. He would catch Amy's scent, follow it briefly, and then lose it just as quickly, as if it had vanished into the air. It defied explanation. The mission no longer felt like a rescue, it had become a riddle. The entire community in Jackson was shaken. People who had never met Amy found themselves haunted by her story. The idea that someone could disappear so completely, in a place so familiar, unsettled everyone. Sarah Jenkins didn't believe in random chance. She knew these mountains intimately, had grown up in their shadow. The Tetons could be unforgiving, but they didn't just erase people without leaving a trace. Lost hikers were usually found, even if the outcome wasn't always hopeful. But Amy had left behind no sign, and that was what disturbed Sarah the most. This wasn't how these cases went. It wasn't how nature behaved. Returning once again to the trailhead near String Lake, Sarah tried to piece together Amy's final steps. The Subaru was still parked exactly as it had been from the beginning. Nothing had changed. Sarah remembered the couple from Ohio who had taken Amy's picture by the lake, the last known image of her. In that photo, Amy's face was lit up with excitement, the mountains towering behind her. It was hard to believe how quickly everything had shifted. As the sun dipped lower in the sky, casting deep shadows across the landscape, Sarah tightened her grip on Zeus's leash. The scent of pine and damp soil filled the air, both familiar and unsettling. Zeus moved ahead, nose close to the ground, still searching, still trying. It was as though he knew something was there just out of reach. The trail led them deeper into the forest, where the trees closed in and the path became more treacherous. Sarah's heart pounded as she watched Zeus navigate the terrain with care. The uncertainty of what lay ahead pressed down on her with every step. Since the moment Amy disappeared, questions had been piling up, questions no one could yet answer. And Sarah was beginning to fear that the truth, when it finally came, might not bring comfort, but only more mystery. Each footfall echoed in the quiet, magnified by the stillness that surrounded her. The Grand Tetons loomed above like ancient sentinels, silent and unmoving. Sarah Jenkins couldn't shake the feeling that if the mountains could speak, they would finally tell her what had happened to Amy Turner. But they remained silent. There, jagged silhouettes casting long shadows over a mystery that only deepened with time. At first, hope had fueled the search. Amy was experienced, well-prepared, and familiar with the terrain. Surely she would be found quickly. But as the days dragged on, that hope began to fray. The optimism that had once energized the search teams was now replaced with a quiet urgency, a growing desperation. Despite using advanced tracking tools and covering every possible route, there was still no sign of Amy. Zeus, led Sarah into a part of the ravine she had already combed earlier in the search. But this time felt different. The air carried a strange stillness, as though the wilderness itself was holding its breath. Zeus stopped abruptly. His body stiffened, ears alert, tail lowered. He had sensed something. Sarah's heartbeat quickened. She dropped to one knee beside him, watching his nose twitch as he carefully moved forward. It was the first time in days she had seen him this focused. Then Sarah spotted just a sliver of color among the brush. A scrap of fabric snagged on a thorn bush. She reached for it and examined the material. It was coarse, faded from sun exposure. It looked like part of a hiking shirt. Not much to go on, but it was something. And it didn't look accidental. It didn't feel like Amy had simply brushed past it. It felt intentional. Standing, Sarah tried to steady her thoughts. Had Amy left this behind on purpose? A signal, a silent cry for help, left in plain sight. Zeus seemed to think so. He moved again, picking up a new trail, this time with purpose. Sarah followed him. Deeper into the ravine, the terrain growing rougher with every step. The trees closed in around them until they emerged into a small clearing. Twilight was falling fast, painting the sky in deep purples and blues. In that dim light, Sarah saw something that made her breath catch. A pair of boots. Dirty, scuffed, and unmistakable, Amy's boots. They were lying near a rocky outcrop, abandoned as if someone had taken them off in a hurry. Sarah approached slowly, kneeling beside them. The realization hit hard. Amy had been here. Something had happened. This wasn't the mark of someone simply lost or disoriented. Amy was careful, always prepared. Leaving her boots behind didn't make sense unless she'd had no choice. Sarah's thoughts spiraled. Had Amy been forced to flee, injured, taken? Zeus barked, pulling her out of her head. He had picked up the scent again and was already moving ahead. The sun had dipped below the horizon now, and full night had taken hold. Sarah's flashlight carved a narrow path through the darkness, illuminating the jagged rocks of the ravine. It was a dangerous route, but she trusted Zeus's instincts more than anything else. She followed him step by step, alert to every shift in the air, every shadow. As they pushed deeper into the wilderness, the silence thickened. It wasn't peaceful, it was oppressive, almost watchful. Sarah couldn't shake the sensation that they were being observed, not by wildlife, but by something older, more elusive. The Tetons had always been formidable, but this felt different. It felt personal. She pressed on, following Zeus into the darkness, her mind turning over every possibility. This was no longer about finding a missing hiker. This was about uncovering a truth hidden within the folds of the mountain. A truth the wilderness didn't want to give up. The days had blurred into one another. What began as a standard search and rescue operation had become something else. Entirely a daily ritual, driven by obsession and fueled by the unknown. The Tetons stood untouched, as they always had, but the people searching them had changed. The air hung heavy with unease, and no one could escape the growing sense that something was deeply wrong. Zeus remained steadfast, leading the charge each day. Sarah had come to rely on his quiet determination, his uncanny ability to sense what humans could not. Even when the trail had gone cold, he had kept moving, unwavering. She recognized the look in his eyes, a focus that couldn't be shaken. It was as if he knew something she didn't, as if he could hear the whispers of the mountain. On the seventh day, Sarah stood once again at the base of Paintbrush Canyon. Everything looked the same: towering ridges, tangled willows, and that oppressive quiet. But the feeling had changed. The mystery was no longer about a missing person. It was about a place that didn't want to be understood. And Sarah, despite everything, was more determined than ever to understand it. The air was thick, pressing down around her as each step crunched over the gravel beneath her boots. The search was beginning to feel like a futile game of hide-and-seek, played out in an endless wilderness too vast to ever fully cover. "I don't know how much longer I can do this," Sarah murmured, glancing at Zeus, who was intently sniffing the path ahead. Her voice broke the silence as she glanced at her watch. Nearly 2 weeks had gone by, and there was still nothing. No trace of Amy. It was as if she had vanished without a single clue, her absence as baffling as it was unreal. Zeus came to a sudden stop, his nose twitching. He lifted his head sharply, his body going rigid. Sarah's heart jumped as she took a cautious step forward. "What is it, boy?" she asked in a hushed voice, kneeling beside him. A low growl rumbled in his chest. He had picked up something. Without hesitation, Zeus moved toward a thick patch of underbrush. Sarah followed close behind, eyes scanning every inch of the surrounding forest. The trees here grew densely packed, their limbs tangled and reaching. There was a faint scent in the air, distinct, unmistakable. Amy, but this wasn't just a trail. It felt intentional, like Amy had deliberately tried to leave something behind. "Good boy," Sarah said, her voice calm but urgent. "Keep going." Zeus pressed deeper into the brush, his movements more focused now. The path veered unexpectedly, leading them in a direction Sarah hadn't considered before. The terrain grew rougher as they ascended, and with each step, the scent became stronger. The silence was broken only by the sound of Zeus's paws navigating the uneven ground and Sarah's increasingly rapid breaths. As they continued, a sense of foreboding crept in. It felt like they were stepping into the unknown, where answers might finally emerge or the mystery could deepen beyond comprehension. Then, halfway up a rocky incline, something caught Sarah's eye. Amid the tangled brush and fallen limbs, a flash of color stood out, something that didn't belong. She moved closer and gently pushed the branches aside to reveal a small, weather-worn object. Her fingers trembled as she picked it up. A camera strap, frayed, dirty, but unmistakably one that belonged to a Nikon DSLR, Amy's camera strap. The realization hit her like a wave. Amy had been here. This close. It looked like the strap had been discarded in a hurry, as if she'd been forced to drop it and move on. Sarah stood frozen, her mind racing. Why would Amy abandon her camera, the one thing she'd always cherished? Photography had never been just a pastime for her. It was her way of seeing and sharing the world. Carefully, Sarah tucked the strap into her backpack, her thoughts spiraling. She had to return to base camp. This was the first real lead they'd had. As she turned, Zeus barked sharply, snapping her out of her thoughts. He was moving again, nose to the ground, every movement filled with purpose. Sarah hesitated. He wasn't done yet. Something else was out there. She followed him, her heartbeat quickening. They arrived at a small clearing, bordered by towering pines and sharp rock formations. Zeus slowed near a large boulder, sniffing intently, first at the ground, then the air. He circled the boulder a few times before sitting back on his haunches, eyes locked in a focused gaze. Sarah's stomach dropped. Nothing looked unusual at first glance, but Zeus's reaction was clear. She knelt beside him and examined the base of the boulder more closely. There, wedged between the rocks, was a scrap of dull red fabric, its edges frayed. Her heart pounded. As she reached out and touched it, the cloth was coarse and weathered, a torn piece of a hiking jacket. Amy's, most likely. It looked as though it had been yanked away. Her thoughts spun. This wasn't just someone losing their way in the forest. Amy hadn't simply gone missing. Something had happened, something urgent enough to make her leave. Behind the things she held dear, her camera, her jacket, this was no ordinary disappearance. Sarah rose slowly, the weight of what she'd found sinking in. "What happened to you, Amy?" she whispered. Zeus let out a quiet whine, as if echoing her question. They had uncovered something real, something that might finally help piece together. What had gone so terribly wrong? It still wasn't enough. Too many questions remained, and the pieces refused to fit together. Sarah looked down at Zeus, who was watching her intently, waiting for her signal. "Let's go," she said, her tone calm but unwavering. They had made progress, real progress, but deep down, she knew this was just the beginning. The path ahead was long, and now more than ever, she needed answers. The days were starting to blur, an endless cycle of searching and clinging to hope. Amy Turner had been gone for over 2 weeks, and the leads had dried up. Ranger Sarah Jenkins had examined every aspect of the investigation with surgical precision, following every thread, every hint, no matter how small. But despite relentless efforts by the search teams, the wilderness had swallowed Amy whole. No body, no signs of a struggle, just silence. A void filled only with questions that refused to be answered. Then, just when the weight of uncertainty seemed unbearable, the mountains offered a clue, unexpected but undeniable. Ranger David Chen, a seasoned wildlife tracker who spent years observing golden eagles in the Tetons, was conducting a routine survey in a remote high-altitude basin. His work took him deep into uncharted areas, places most people avoided. This particular area was rugged and treacherous, even for experienced hikers. It was there, near the edge of an eagle's nest, that he made a discovery that would change everything. Scanning a distant cliff face through his binoculars, something unusual caught his eye. A streak of color against the muted tones of rock and earth. At first, he assumed it was litter left behind by careless hikers, but as he adjusted his focus, a chill ran through him. This wasn't trash, it was fabric, and not just any fabric. It looked like it belonged to a woman's hiking outfit. Holy hell, he muttered under his breath. As the realization settled in, his pulse quickened. It was the red trim, just like the one on Amy Turner's jacket. But what truly shook him wasn't just the piece of clothing. It was what he saw next, a section of the fabric woven into the eagle's nest itself. Without hesitation, David radioed his position to the Park Service. He knew this wasn't something to overlook. He began the difficult climb toward the ledge, his thoughts racing. This wasn't nature reclaiming debris. Something about this felt deliberate, wrong. When he finally reached the nest, the truth hit him hard. He stood at the edge of the Tetons, among the high cliffs where eagles made their homes and now, disturbingly, where evidence of Amy Turner had surfaced. Torn and weathered, the jacket had been integrated into the nest alongside twigs and sticks. As David examined the contents more closely, he spotted a scrap of turquoise nylon, likely from Amy's hiking gear. There was no mistaking it. This wasn't random. This was hers. With hands slightly trembling, he grabbed his radio. "I think I've found something connected to Amy Turner," he said, his voice tight. "We need a team up here." News of the find spread quickly through the command post. This was no longer just a missing person case. The discovery marked a turning point, something far more unsettling. Amy's gear turning up in an eagle's nest was more than bizarre. It was deeply disturbing. How had her belongings ended up here? What had she gone through? As teams mobilized and plans shifted, Sarah Jenkins felt a growing sense of unease. This wasn't about someone getting lost in the backcountry. The silence surrounding Amy's disappearance had meaning. And now, with this grim clue, the truth began to emerge. Amy hadn't simply vanished, someone had made her disappear. Zeus stayed close, alert and ready, his gaze moving steadily across the terrain. He had been her constant companion through every step of this ordeal, and now she relied on him more than ever. The answer was out there. She could feel it just beyond reach. The investigation had taken a darker, more dangerous turn. And Sarah understood now, they weren't just tracking a missing hiker anymore. They were hunting something else entirely. Someone. That evening, she stood at the edge of the Teton Range, staring out over the shadowed valley. The landscape, once majestic and serene, now felt haunted, an ancient witness to the horror slowly unfolding beneath its peaks. She had seen both the nobility and cruelty of people in her years as a ranger. And now, as the sun dipped below the mountains, she prepared herself for what was coming next. The search for Amy had become a pursuit of justice. And it wasn't over, not yet. But this was different. It went beyond a missing person case. It was a calculated act, one that used the isolation of the wilderness as part of the crime itself. The forest wasn't just the backdrop, it had been weaponized. Amy's parents, Mark and Sarah Turner, had been clinging to hope, refusing to give up. For weeks, they'd endured the agony of not knowing, their grief visible in every word, every expression. Mark, in particular, had thrown himself into the search, determined not to let his daughter be forgotten. But even his determination couldn't override the harsh truth. The wilderness was unforgiving, and its secrets were deeply buried. Sarah Jenkins had come to accept the same truth. They weren't just tracking a missing woman anymore, they were following the trail of someone dangerous. Someone who had used the vast, remote terrain as a cover for something far more sinister. As each hour passed, Sarah felt the weight of both urgency and risk. The closer they got to the truth, the more dangerous the path became. This was no longer a recovery mission. It was an active pursuit of a predator. And that reality changed everything. Zeus, always at her side, scanned the forest with sharp, knowing eyes. He was more than a working dog. He was her partner, her constant in the chaos. They'd faced rough terrain, harsh weather, and long days before. But this was different. This was darker. At first light the next day, Sarah called the team together. The fabric found in the eagle's nest wasn't just a clue, it was confirmation. Amy had been there, and something had gone terribly wrong. They had to follow the evidence, no matter where it led. The answers were out there, buried in the shadows of the Tetons. And Sarah and Zeus were going to find them. What followed was a tense and exhausting series of days. The investigation, once stagnant, was now alive again, though not in the way anyone had hoped. The discovery in the eagle's nest had injected fresh urgency into the case, but it also introduced darker implications. Amy hadn't simply gotten lost. She had been targeted. It had all the marks of something deliberate. A predator had chosen this place, knowing it would be difficult, maybe impossible, for anyone to intervene. Sarah and Zeus had uncovered a piece of the truth, but it was just the beginning. There were still so many unanswered questions. Inside the Teton County Sheriff's Office, Sarah stood in the command center with a cooling cup of coffee in hand, staring at a map stretched across the table. Red markers indicated Amy's planned route, bright pinpoints of intention amid the endless green of the surrounding wilderness. It felt surreal. How could someone vanish so completely in terrain they knew so well? Amy had been prepared. She was experienced, yet something or someone had caught her off guard. A knock at the door broke her focus. Mike Connolly stepped in, his expression serious. "We've got something," he said. "A lead, maybe more." Sarah raised an eyebrow. "Go on." "We've identified someone who might be connected. Name's Robert Frazier. He's a transient been moving through this area off and on. Someone saw him near the trailhead the same day Amy disappeared." Sarah's expression hardened. She didn't recognize the name, but that didn't matter. What mattered was whether this man had anything to do with Amy's vanishing. "Tell me everything," she said, gesturing for Mike to sit. He dropped a file onto the table and opened it, flipping to a composite sketch. A couple hiking that day remembered him. Said he was alone, dressed in old military-style gear. Didn't speak to anyone. No eye contact, just passed by like he didn't want to be seen. Sarah studied the sketch. The man looked lean, weathered eyes hollow. The kind of face that could easily blend in. Forgettable until it wasn't. He looked like someone used to disappearing. "There's more," Mike said. "We're still digging through his background. But he's got a history. Older charges, assault, some other violent incidents. Nothing recent, but enough to raise concern." Sarah leaned back, her thoughts racing. If this man had anything to do with Amy's disappearance, they were dealing with someone capable of violence. Someone who had used the wilderness to cover his tracks. The map on the table wasn't just a search grid anymore. It was a crime scene. And Robert Frazier had just become the prime suspect. He had a history of drifting, taking on odd jobs, staying in motels or rustic cabins, never settling in one place for long. Not exactly the kind of person you'd want to cross paths with. Sarah felt a knot tighten in her stomach. This was the type of man she had always feared might be responsible for Amy's disappearance. Someone skilled at staying hidden. Someone who could move through remote areas without drawing attention. The next step was clear. They had to find him immediately. As the search for Robert Frazier gained momentum, the investigation took a darker turn. The deeper they delved into his background, the more disturbing it became. His past was filled with red flags, short-lived jobs that ended in conflict, abrupt departures from towns, and a pattern of living on the fringes. One detail stood out above the rest: his presence in the Jackson area during the time Amy vanished. The pieces were beginning to fall into place in a way that sent shivers down Sarah's spine. It wasn't just his record or the composite sketch that raised alarms, it was the unsettling sense that this man was somehow too close to the case. Frazier had been staying in a motel near Jackson, checking in right around the time Amy began her hike. Sarah had seen this pattern before: individuals who hovered just near the edge of a crime scene, close enough to observe, yet distant enough to evade notice. Worn down from days of chasing leads, Sarah leaned back in her chair and rubbed her temples. But this was different. This time the lead felt solid to overlook. Frazier had to be the one. A special task force was quickly formed, including park rangers and local authorities. The plan was straightforward: locate Frazier and bring him in. They already had enough to justify an arrest, but they needed to be certain. Their search led them to a secluded ranch outside Billings, Montana. Far from any population center, it was an ideal place for someone who didn't want to be found. Frazier had taken a job there under the pretense of seasonal construction worker. Convenient excuse to stay hidden, but like so many others before him, he was eventually found alone, guarded, and unapologetic. When the team arrived at the property with a search warrant, Frazier had vanished. The house, weathered and silent, stood like a shell. The wind whispered against the walls, adding an eerie stillness to the scene. Inside, the silence was broken only by the sound of boots on creaking floorboards. The search team stumbled upon something that froze them in their tracks: a footlocker, rusted but locked tight. When they forced it open, the contents were nothing short of horrifying. Inside were several women's driver's licenses, bits of jewelry, and strands of hair, mementos of victims past. At the very bottom, wrapped in an old faded t-shirt, was a camera. A Nikon D750. Sarah's breath caught in her throat. It was unmistakably Amy's. The discovery shocked the team. While they now had a direct link to Frazier, they still needed definitive proof. The camera's memory card would provide it. At the forensics lab, technicians quickly retrieved the data. What they uncovered turned Sarah's stomach. The first few images were typical scenic landscapes, consistent with Amy's usual photography. But then the tone changed. The later images had been taken by someone else. Frazier. His photos documented Amy's final hours, capturing the terror in her eyes and her desperate struggle. The images were graphic and horrifying, leaving no room for doubt. Amy's suffering had been preserved in stark, unflinching detail. In the interrogation room, Frazier sat with a chilling calm. He offered no denials, no remorse. When Sarah and Mike confronted him with the photographs, he simply looked at them without emotion. His admission came quietly, devoid of any feeling. "That's me," he said, nodding toward one of the photos. "She shouldn't have been out there alone." The trial moved swiftly. The photographic evidence, combined with Frazier's own emotionless confession, left no doubt of his guilt. Amy's parents, Mark and Sarah Turner, endured the proceedings. With a mixture of sorrow and anger etched on their faces, the answers they had long sought were finally laid bare. But it wasn't the kind of closure that brought peace. Amy was gone, and nothing could erase the pain of what she endured. As the trial concluded and Robert Frazier received a life sentence, a small part of the burden began to lift from Sarah's shoulders. It wasn't a triumph, and certainly not a happy ending, but at least the truth was finally known. Amy Turner was no longer just a name on a missing persons report. Her story had been reclaimed, painful though it was, and it would not be forgotten. For Ranger Sarah Jenkins and her loyal canine partner, Zeus, the case had come to an end. Yet the mountains still stood, as silent and indifferent as ever. The Tetons had borne witness to Amy's final moments, and had kept their secrets until they could no longer. In the months following Frazier's capture, Sarah found little in the way of peace. The justice system had done its part, delivering a sentence, issuing closure in the eyes of the law but not in her heart. The mountains that had once felt like a sanctuary, full of wild beauty and wonder, now seemed distant and cold. Where she had once seen serenity, she now saw reminders of danger overlooked, warnings unheeded. She had returned often to that same ridge with Zeus, standing watch over the rugged peaks and valleys that had defined the search. In those long, silent moments, Sarah came to understand something deeper. The wilderness wasn't cruel or compassionate, it simply existed. It could be breathtaking, it could be lethal, and it could be both at once. But it wasn't nature that had taken Amy's life, it was a man. A predator who had exploited the wild to cover his tracks and hide his crimes. Fraser's confession had brought a swift end to the trial. The evidence was undeniable. The photographs, the camera, and his haunting words had laid bare the truth. Amy had been followed, attacked, and murdered. Her life stolen by someone lurking in the shadows, waiting for the right moment. And now the world knew what had happened. Still, for Amy's loved ones, no measure of justice could erase the pain. A year had passed since the search began, and Sarah had slowly adapted to the quiet aftermath. The emotional toll of the investigation didn't fade overnight. It clung to her, especially in the quiet moments. In the images that replayed in her mind, the discovery of Amy's camera, the gruesome reality of what had taken place so close to where they had been looking, and yet, something about the Tetons kept calling her back. Though they had been the backdrop to tragedy, they were also a source of strength. They had offered her purpose when the case seemed impossible, and grounded her when the truth came to light. She couldn't walk away from them, not even now. This land was part of her, just as it had been for Amy. Sarah's mission didn't end with Fraser's conviction. There were still stories waiting in the silence. Still lives that might depend on the vigilance of someone who had learned firsthand how thin the line between beauty and danger could be. On a new morning, Sarah stood once again at the trailhead. Zeus at her side. His muzzle had grayed, but his eyes were still sharp, still scanning the path ahead like they had done 100 times before. It was familiar ground, yet the air felt different now. She had answers, but there would always be new questions. New threats hidden behind nature's serene mask. Today, she was leading a group of fresh recruits on their first field exercise. Officially, it was a training mission. Unofficially, it was much more than that. Sarah understood the stakes better than anyone. What she had learned through painful experience was something she needed to pass on. She looked at the eager faces gathered around her, hopeful, determined, just as she had once been. But now, she saw through the eyes of someone changed by the reality of loss. This job wasn't just about tracking or search patterns. It was about recognizing the dangers others might miss. It was about being prepared to confront the worst, even in the most peaceful-looking places. She wanted them to understand that the wilderness, for all its wonder, could be used as a mask, one that hid not just people who were lost, but people who were dangerous. People like Robert Fraser. And if they truly wanted to protect others, they had to see beyond the trees and trails. They had to be ready to shine a light into the dark places of the world. Zeus gave a soft bark, snapping Sarah out of her thoughts. "All right, team," she said, her tone firm, but laced with quiet determination. "Let's get moving. We've got a long day ahead." As the group began their hike along the familiar, winding path through the thick forest, Sarah's mind wandered back to everything that had unfolded. She thought of Amy, how she had come to this place in search of beauty, of Passant, of the family she had left behind. And she thought of how these mountains, as grand and awe-inspiring as they were, had stood silently through it all, bearing witness to a terrible truth. But Sarah had made a promise to herself. Amy's story wouldn't be forgotten, wouldn't fade into the vast silence of the Tetons. These mountains held countless secrets, but now they also carried the weight of a story, one of resilience, of justice, and of a father's unwavering devotion to his daughter. Later that evening, Sarah found herself once again on the edge of the cliff, where she had stood so many times before. The sunset spilled across the horizon, casting the sky in deep oranges and soft purples. For the first time in a long while, a quiet peace settled over her, not the kind that came from letting go, but the kind that came from holding on. From remembering. Seuss lay beside her, his head resting gently on his paws, calm in the fading light. Sarah inhaled deeply, the crisp mountain air filling her lungs. She closed her eyes and, for a moment, could almost hear Amy's voice carried on, the breeze soft, almost playful. "Good girl," she whispered, the hint of a smile forming as emotion welled in her chest. She had done what she set out to do. The truth was no longer buried. Amy's voice had been heard, and her memory preserved. Now, it was time to move forward. As the last glow of sunlight disappeared behind the jagged peaks, Sarah turned away from the overlook. Her heart was still heavy, but there was hope within it too. The search had come to an end, but her mission was far from over. There were still dangers hidden in the wild, still stories waiting in the silence. And beneath the vast star-filled sky, one truth echoed in her mind with unwavering clarity: Amy Turner's story would live on. In the hearts of those who had searched for her, fought for her, and loved her, would never be forgotten.